Of the numerous intellectuals arrested after communism began in Romania, one was the psychologist Nicolae Margineanu from the University of Cluj. Being at the height of his professional career, having studied at some of the most prestigious universities in Europe and in the United States, having published 12 psychology books, and being considered one of the most prominent psychologists from the country, Nicolae Margineanu was arrested on April 14, 1948, at 11 o'clock in the morning. Then, as the framed result of a trial set up by the communist authorities, he was convicted to 25 years of tough imprisonment. From the moment of arrest, his future was practically destroyed. His personal life and his career were irreversibly damaged, and the life of his family, his wife, and their 2 children, Daniela and Nicolae, was thrown off balance. His books were forbidden, and his name no longer appeared anymore in publications or printed matter. Instead of continuing to write specialized books, Nicolae Margineanu, the psychologist with the most comprehensive international education and training, as he was called by the renowned American psychologist Gordon Allport, was now imprisoned and brutally investigated, coerced into giving statement after statement of his alleged guilt against the Communist Party policies. The inquest and trial in which he was involved was a setup. The Nicolae Margineanu case was one of the tens of thousands of fabricated affairs through which the communist regime systematically destroyed normal life in Romania. How is this possible?
Lucrurile mergeau tot la vale, speranțele se reduceau. A venit cumplitul an 40.
Things were still deteriorating, and hope was diminishing. Then came the terrifying year of 48, when he was accused of things, and then arrested. You see, as a member of the governed, I followed him in my mind, and with increasing fright, seeing how the cream of the crop of Romanian society were taken into prison. At the same time, I heard all the time about conditions becoming more and more difficult in the camps.
Proiectul Nicolae Margineanu, psiholog în temnițele comuniste.
The project Nicolae Margineanu, psychologist in communist prisons, represented for me, as researcher at the CNSAS, the National Council for the Study of Security Archives, a very ample project which lasted for more than 4 years. A project which had as a target not only the reunifying or the re-expressing of the past, or the biography of a person with historical data, but, more importantly, I wanted to reunify a biography of a scientist who was simply cancelled from the scientific life, torn away from the academic and social environment for more than 16 years. The declarations, which can be totaled to, I estimate, I did make calculations back when I made the research, to thousands of sheets of declarations. Declarations written once, twice, 3 times a day. Declarations given under inquest, which could be given under pressure or under torture. It is these traces that are visible in each of them. But especially in the renowned statement from July the 6th, 1948. It was over 100 sheets of paper in length. From the lectured statements, there are signs. There are signs of torture. They are found again and again. They are obvious, even if we only imagine them and have no sufficient evidences. But there are proofs that the texts repeat themselves. And the texts are confused. At one moment, the texts are written in a special written method. I say special because it is the method of writing by an extremely tired man, near the limits of physical confrontation. We didn't only imagine this, we also believed this at that moment. Then, when the ink on the pages seemed to be diluted, watered down, we thought there a tear had fallen from his suffering.
Că în momentul acela, atunci când cerneala părea diluată, să cred că acolo a fost o lacrimă a suferinței.
Am intrat în celulă și am fost întâmpinat de 3 oameni îmbrăcați în zeghe, așa se numeau acele haine vărgate pe care le
I entered the cell, and I was met by 3 men, all dressed in thick twilled clothes. This is what we called the striped clothes that were worn by the detainees. The political prisoners were lumped together with criminals of real crimes, because we were also considered to be committing a real crime. Anyway, the one who met me greeted me with warmth and friendliness, and was a little reluctant to trust me. The man was Professor Margineanu. He began to teach me the way to learn, the way to behave, all in order to survive. When he told me he had already done 3 years, I was stunned. I couldn't imagine someone surviving for so long in jail, in those cells which I was so frightened in, the holes through which I passed, in my glasses, with the pushing and taunts. I looked at him. Indeed, he was pale, and a little worn out, but smiling. He didn't look like a frightened man.
Profesor Margineanu îmi spunea exact ceea ce trebuie să le spun și cum să mă comport. Adică, să nu mă sperii.
No, Professor Margineanu told me exactly what to do, what to say to them, and how to behave. That is, not to be frightened, to answer in short sentences, and not to speak more than what I was asked to dumb down my language, not to argue angrily, to give the impression that I was caught up in what the inquirer was saying. But I had to keep my integrity, and at the same time, the secrets I wished to hide. The professor warned me that the jailer was a big barbarian, about 2 meters in height, and weighing around 120 kilos, and that he would pick you up and place you into the lift. This is indeed what happened, but I was prepared for it, and as such not scared. The professor also told me that I would be forced to count to 10 steps. In fact, there were 12, but he told me to count to 10 so that I could skip stairs which were designed to make the walker fall. This was so the jailer could ram my head against the wall and call me an imbecile that does not even know how to count. But all of these proposed actions were done to prepare me for the inquiry which would follow. It was meant to scare me, soften me up for the inquisition that was to follow.
Lucrul ăsta era făcut pentru ca să pregătească ancheta care urma. Să te duci acolo înspăimântat deja și să fii pregătit pentru cei care urmau să te ancheteze.
This survival lesson of Nicolae Margineanu can be a subject for debate, for the experience in critical situations. But I took this experience as an immense advantage, not only for the intellectual Margineanu, but also for the scientist, the one who once wrote about the human condition.
He was thrashed by an illiterate person, a man who had no idea about what culture meant, what a university professor represented, what the meaning of the science he taught could provide, and who hated him not only because he was different, but also because this prisoner represented something that he could not understand.
After the first year of detention at Aiud prison, the inmate, number 5012, the former university professor Nicolae Margineanu, weighed only 43 kilos. In other words, half his normal weight. From the outside, his wife, Cristina Margineanu, who didn't know precisely in which jail her husband was imprisoned, sent parcels to all the prisons in the country, trying desperately to trace him, but all the packages were returned to her with the message, address unknown. In the 16 years of imprisonment, Nicolae Margineanu had permission to write to his family only twice, but these 2 letters never reached home, being kept in his detainee's record. Outside, his wife found a job with difficulty as female educator in a tuberculosis observation sanatorium located a few kilometers from Cluj. Because the children of the political prisoners were expelled from schools, his wife divorced him formally, hoping that in this way to protect her own 2 children. Daniela and Nicolae held the maiden name of their mother for a few years, Arvanitis. But in spite of this camouflage, they were systematically scrutinized by the authorities and expelled several times from college and then from university. In the 16 years of imprisonment, his wife and 2 children succeeded in seeing him only 1 single time, at an auxiliary trial. A well-wisher, in whom the family is grateful to this day, informed them by an unsigned letter that Nicolae Margineanu would be summoned as witness in another trial. So his wife and the 2 children traveled to the trial in Bucharest. They saw Nicolae Margineanu in the dock, dressed in thick twilled clothes and overseen with harshness by a guard, so that he couldn't look towards the hall. They couldn't exchange even a single word with him. At the end, his family waited in the back of the law court building, hoping to see him just one more time. Because the prisoner, noticing his wife and children, stopped for a moment, the guard pushed him brutally in the prisoner's van. This painful image tortured them for a long time. In the 16 years and 2 months of detention, his wife made, in vain, a written statement asking for the right to send parcels and letters, all of them ending with, "We fight for peace," a twist of the phrase requested by the new regime.
Se încingeau discuții, mai ales pe teme de ordin politic. Nicolae Margineanu era filozof, era un om de cultură, era un om pe care nu le interesa dacă
There were animated discussions concerning politics. Nicolae Margineanu was a philosopher and a highly cultured man who didn't care if the gruel was thick or water thin, or if we were going to be rescued now or later. Nicolae Margineanu was constantly giving speeches about Romanian cultural perspectives and the basis of it. I remember 12 discussions he led. Who were the audience of these discussions he held? We were the prisoners. Sometimes after he would finish a topic, we would ask him to explain, and he took great delight in doing so. We revived for an hour or 2 the feel of the university, where he had worked and where he felt most at home.
Cum s-ar spune, reînviam pentru un ceas 2 mediul universitar, unde trăi și unde se simțea bine, unde era vocația lui.
Deci la Gherla, în acele, cred, 4-5 zile cel mult câte le-am petrecut împreună, cred că am stat de dimineața până seara de vorbă. A găsit în mine și un foarte bun ascultător.
Therefore, at Gherla, I think 4 or 5 days at the most we spent together. I think we talked from morning till night. He found in me a good listener, because I have to confess that I spoke to many people in jail. But from Nicolae Margineanu, I had much to listen. He was as I was in a way, but he was more willing to relate. And what he told me, among other things, was what he remembered from America. I knew already about this man, about his studies, about his experiences from American democracy, about how he had solved the problem of 45, 46, and 47 that our country had, how he had met with the Allied Control Commission, the Americans from that commission. I remember him for Transylvania, for reunifying our country, and to say so for our country's rescue, which felt, and everyone knew, it stayed under a very hard conviction through the Soviet troops' presence, and of the occupation power of the entire threatening communist bloc.
Că stă sub o foarte grea condamnare prin prezența trupelor sovietice, puterii de ocupație a întregului bloc amenințător.
Nicolae Margineanu was born on June 22, 1905, in the village of Obreja, in the district of Alba, to a family of faithful peasant country people. He attended the primary school in the village. From his graduate group, he was the only one peasant child, good at education, who continued his studies in the college in Blaj. He attended his last years at the Aurel Vlaicu College from Oraștie, under the guidance of a wonderful teacher, the Professor Aron Demian. He graduated college and was promoted to head of his group of pupils. Born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as a child, he witnessed the great unifying of Transylvania and Romania in Alba Iulia in 1918. He became a student specializing in psychology at the Faculty of Literature and Philosophy at the newly founded Romanian University in Cluj. Due to his clarity of thought and because of his analytical spirit, he was quickly noticed by the professor Florian Ștefănescu Goanga, who appointed him as early as in his second year as an assistant to the Psychology Institute. Nicolae Margineanu graduated at the age of 22, and at the age of 27 he became a Doctor of Philosophy with magna cum laude at the University of Cluj, specializing in psychology. And then, in a short time, he became an assistant at the Psychology Institute of the university. Nicolae Margineanu took advantage of this period of constructive momentum in which Transylvania entered after unifying with its mother country, Romania, and when it was in need of new institutions at an occidental level of skills and of young and well-qualified people. Supported by his mentor, the Professor Ștefănescu Goanga, Nicolae Margineanu attended successive stages of post-university training at the universities of Vienna, Leipzig, Hamburg, and Berlin, where he was guided by great professors of the time. He capitalized the knowledge stored during these stages in several books, such as The Psychology of Exercise, The Psychotechnik in Germany, The Contemporary German Psychology, and The Evolutions Problem, and so on. Impressed by his skills, the professors Kruger, Stern, Kohler, Rupp, and then Kittredge, the director of the Social Sciences Department of the Rockefeller Foundation, recommended Nicolae Margineanu for a Rockefeller grant. In this period of time, he was acquainted with Eufrosina Arvanitis, who came from Constanța to study literature and philosophy at the University of Cluj. In a short space of time, the two young people announced their engagement, and when Nicolae Margineanu received the Rockefeller grant, they married and moved together to the United States. They left for 6 months, but remained there 2 years, because the American professors, as a token of appreciation for his scientific conduct, recommended, by way of exception, the extension of the Rockefeller grant from 6 months to 2 years. Mr. and Mrs. Margineanu were captivated by the American democracy and by the opportunities which this country would offer, and the young Romanian psychologist became friends with many of the professors with which he worked, maintaining the relationship with them until the end of his life. He loved America, like his second mother country, and he wasn't afraid to declare this, even during the investigations from the Securitate. Therefore, he followed the stages of training at Harvard University in 1932, with the psychologist Gordon Allport. At the Chicago University, he studied with the professor Louise Thurstone, an experience which inspired him to write the book The Analysis of Psychological Factors, a book which received favorable reviews in the world of psychology, from Europe to the United States. During this stage, he collaborated with Hadley Cantrill, counselor at the White House under the 4 presidents Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy Sr. at the huge University of Columbia, which had about 36,000 students at the time. He studied with the professors Woodworth, Thorndike, and McDougall. He then studied at Yale, Stanford University of California, and at the University of Baltimore, where he worked with Adolf Meyer, the most important figure in American psychoanalysis at the time. Obviously, besides studies, Mr. and Mrs. Margineanu found time to enjoy life, to travel, and to visit the United States of America. They met very many famous people and became friends with many others. It was the happiest period of their lives. The future seemed normal and happy for them. As a matter of fact, Nicolae Margineanu received several invitations to remain in the United States as a professor of the universities of Duke, Columbia, and Bard College, but he chose to return to his homeland, where he thought there was a serious need for him. His professional career was completed in England at the University of London, where his mentor was Charles Spearman, then in France at the Sorbonne and College of France, as part of the program coordinated by Pierre Janet and Henry Pierron, with whom he collaborated with studies of factual analysis in the book The Psychological Years. With such a professional background of the highest level, he returned to his homeland in his mid-30s, where he was appointed as a university lecturer at the Institute of Psychology, and then university reader at the Chair of Psychology at the University of Cluj.
De aceea mi-am dat seama că Nicolae Margineanu, când împărea în ideile sale, în vorbele pe care le avea, împărea atât de deosebit de ceilalți.
I realized that Nicolae Margineanu looked so special when confronted by others was due to respect, due to the experiences he had in life, which did not come from political books or books of history, psychology or sociology. Rather, it was from having lived in a great democracy, and this made him by far one of the special ones. Of course, this along with his charisma.
Desigur, era și carisma sa personală.
Deși a petrecut foarte mulți ani în închisoare, în mărturiile pe care ulterior le-a depus și în cărțile despre propria lui viață, cărțile lui autobiografice, partea care revine timpului petrecut în închisoare este foarte redusă.
Although he spent many years in jail, in his autobiography, the section of his time spent on talking about his time in prison is very short. This demonstrates his perception of his life. While in actual fact he spent 16 years in prison, in his mind that part of his life is much shorter than the time he spent outside of the prison. His autobiography transcends the boundaries of historical circumstance and rather shows us his own private timeline of his life.
Deci, scurt spus, geografia interioară a transfigurat geografia externă în care a fost nevoit să trăiască datorită împrejurărilor istorice.
His family life fulfilled. 2 children were born, Daniela and Nicolae, and he succeeded in building a house in Cluj, at number 7 Nicolae Iorga Street. "My sweet home in Cluj, raised through my toil," he would usually say. An author of books, he was at the same time a founder of institutions. He organized laboratories of industrial psychology from the airplane plants and wagon and armament factories of Brasov, from the Reșița plants and the iron and steel works of Hunedoara, as well as the labs of the Astra Mineral Oil Exploitation Society of Câmpina and Ploiești. He founded experimental technical schools, which paved the way of apprenticeships for technical education, having an essential contribution to the implementation of the psychology of labor in our country. Nicolae Margineanu didn't practice politics and didn't enroll in any political party. The peasant ethics from home combined with the lessons of American democracy, naturally made him a Democrat. In his early 40s, in Sibiu, where the university moved due to the Transylvanian Session, Margineanu, due to the fact that he refused to adopt the extremist and racial slogans of that age, brought the Legionnaires' hate upon himself. In the autumn of 1940, during the Legionnaire government, pressures were made for his dismissal from university, and only the event of the Legionnaires falling quickly from power saved the young professor from their persecution and revenge. At the beginning of the 1940s, he published important works for applied psychology, such as the French Contemporary Psychology, Elements of Psychometric, the Psychotechnique, as well as his fundamental book, The Psychology of the Person, which is dedicated to his mentor, Gordon Allport, from Harvard University. Where the Legionnaires didn't succeed in dismissing Margineanu from university, the Communists succeeded. A short time after the regime's installation in Romania, the danger had seeped in, step by step. At the beginning, Margineanu, due to his American relations, was useful for Romania. Because he finished his studies in the United States and had important contacts in the world university community, and also in the diplomatic one, the Premier Petru Groza asked him to plead before the American Control Commission for the integral recession of Transylvania to Romania. It must be mentioned that Nicolae Margineanu, a patriot with the accomplished fact, fulfilled this delicate mission successfully. But he, similar to other prestigious and democratic intellectuals, represented a potential threat to the new regime. He had contacts abroad and in the homeland. Together with the professors Dimitri Gusti and I.C. Parhon, he contributed to the re-establishment of the American Pal Society. But around that time, being in Arles was the custom. Arles was the friendship association with the Soviet Union, agreed to by the communist leadership. Inspired by the Soviet model, the Communist Party began the process of methodically destroying Romania. In a process of devastation which lasted years, all the country's political, juridical, and administrative structures and institutions were reduced to dust, as well as the property system, the economic life, and the cultural and educational institutes. In this dreadful operation of controlled destruction, not only the country's basic structures collapsed, but also the people. At the University of Cluj, those professors undesirable to the new regime, such as Stefănescu Goangă, Lucian Blaga, Silviu Dragomir, Ioan Lupaș, Nicolae Margineanu, and others, were dismissed from university.
Alexandru Roșca, alături de Petrovici, rectorul universității din perioada aceea, și de alții, au fost în slujba Partidului Comunist și au dus la dărâmarea existenței.
Alexandru Roșca, from Petrovici, was the university's rector in that period of time, and was considered by others in the service of the Communist Party, and acted in such a way as to aid the dispatch of his colleagues. He was the guy who denounced Nicolae. He later bragged to the Internal Affairs Minister that he gave away the spy in America's services. These people contributed to the institution's destruction. And then people came to take the books of the university from the librarian. There was a friend who was left there. I know this because I saw Catarig. He was the doorkeeper of the university. He was the doorkeeper when the institution was formerly Transylvanian, but now he was an ob-job man. The image I remember most is visiting the university of my youth and seeing Catarig there, now a jack of all trades, preparing a pig and slitting its throat, and drinking the fresh blood that poured out. In the background sat the university, our noble institution, debased, and the snow that surrounded it was heavy, but was black and ugly.
ducând la gură și sorbind sângele acela proaspăt al porcului. Mărturisesc, asta este imagine care mi-a rămas a universității care fusese a tinereții mele.
But for Nicolae Margineanu, the worst thing was yet to come. On April 14th, 1948, at 11 o'clock in the morning, Nicolae Margineanu was arrested. He was investigated with specific inquest methods of a totalitarian communist regime, beating and physical and psychological torture, and threatened, "Don't lie to us, as we even know how much milk you suckled from your mother." Sometimes he was forced to write declarations every 5 minutes, and other times he was forced to give declarations day and night, and as a result, there was a declaration manuscript of over 100 pages. The fact that he had been a Rockefeller Scholarship student and that he was vice president of the American Pal Society became counts of accusation, and the fact that, at the request of the Prime Minister, Petru Groza, he had pleaded before the American Control Commission for the integral retrocession of Transylvania to Romania had also turned against him. He was charged of spying and national treason. The context of this setup was of international political implications, namely because the United States accused the Soviet Union of interfering in Romania's internal affairs. In response, Vyshinsky, the USSR's Foreign Affairs Secretary, asked Romania to set up a trial which would prove the opposite and demonstrate that America interfered in the internal life of Romania and was plotting against Romania's interests. After more than 7 months of inquest in the fearful vaults of the Securitate, after numerous declarations and interrogations, the sending at law's order was put forward. According to the setup conceived by the Securitate, Nicolae Margineanu was included in a lot with another 11 investigated prisoners, among which the professor knew only 4. He was charged with treason against his country and, as a supreme irony for a man who was threatened by legionnaires, even of being the founder of the fascist organization. All false charges, without logic, without any concrete and real proof. With the occasion of this judiciary setup, the propaganda and terror machinery came into play, copied after the Soviet model. The ordinary working people from the workshops and factories were obliged to become indignant towards the traitors, and the newspapers published articles of stigmatizing them. In the created hysteria, some of those who took up an attitude asked with proletarian fury that the culprits be tortured and be drawn on the cutting wheel, as were Horia, Kloshka and Krishan, or to scratch their eyes out and to tear out their nails. His and the other 11 defendants' trial, titled by newspapers of the time The Trial of the High National Treason or The Great Finance, began on October 25th, 1948. The sentence, passed on November 2nd, 1948, read as follows. The convict Margineanu Nicolae will carry out the gravest punishment. That is 25 years of hard labor, loss of civic rights during these 25 years, and a fine of 20,000 lei, plus the payment of all the legal costs. He served time in the following prisons: Aiud, Jilava, Pitești, Cluj, Dej, and Gherla. He suffered, like all political prisoners of our jails, of cold and starvation, of lack of fresh air, lack of washing facilities, and lack of sanitation, medicines, and medical assistance. And he suffered deeply of the lack of any news from home. A medical operation, which was performed on him in barbaric conditions at the prison, provoked a lethal cancer years later.
As I studied, I had heard that there was an important psychologist who was in jail, but I was not allowed to read his books due to the fact that they were in the secret reading fund. 2 years after my graduation, I was working in a psychology laboratory in the transport industry, and the laboratory chief brought me the books of Nicolae Margineanu. And he said to me, "Look here, read from these books. You can find out about our field of activity, about the domain in which we work, the psychology of labor." I was already 25, 26 years old, and Nicolae was only released after I had finished my professorate. For the majority of my young life, he had been continuously in jail. First in Aiud, then he was at Pitești, now he was at Jilava, then he was at Malmaison. He went to all the prisons.
On June 27, 1964, Nicolae Margineanu was released from the prison in Aiud. He knew almost nothing about his family, because during the 16 years of detention, he had had the right to only 2 parcels and 2 letters. In the train on the way to Cluj, he ate the packed food and accepted the marvelous green onion offered to him by the passenger. He asked the people from the carriage about the price of bread and of bacon, of cheese, of jam, which seemed to him amazing foodstuff, something from dreams. Then he asked what the monthly wages for a street sweeper were. The former university professor, who didn't want to be a burden to his family, was thinking how he was going to support himself. At his departure, his daughter was 12 years old. Now, at his return, she was married. When he left, his son was 8 years old. Now he was a student in Bucharest. Also on his return, he discovered the tragedy of his brother, Petru Margineanu. He, convicted of 20 years' imprisonment, was first tortured and then simply executed, together with another 5 peasants.
Și într-o seară, un telefon. Aici, Margineanu. Așa, o emoție m-a cuprins și...
And one evening, I got a telephone call. "Here is Margineanu." An emotion seized me, and I heard him say with perfect naturalness and with invariable spontaneity, "How are you?" He then said, "Would it be possible for you to come and visit me, as I am in need of a medical examination?" I responded, "Of course. Is tomorrow at the clinic possible?" I told him where to go, and we agreed on the time. The emotion that I felt was intense, and I wondered how he would look. This man was so vigorous, so spontaneous, so conquering, is the only way that I can put it. I arrived early. I don't remember exactly what time, maybe 10, 11 o'clock. I couldn't wait, so I went to the courtyard to welcome him. I wondered how it would be to see him, recognize him, and at exactly the defined hour he appeared in the courtyard of the clinic, on the Soda, the 3rd medical clinic, on the side through the big clinic's gate. And he looked so vibrant. He asked me what I was doing waiting for him outside, and he embraced me and said, "How are you? How's your family?" I was astonished when I saw him. To myself I said, "God, but how? How could a man stand against so much and then have him stand here in front of me with such ease?" It has to be said that he looked exactly the same as I remembered him, the only difference being that he looked a little bit weaker.
Bine, mai slăbit, sigur, dar tot așa sprinten.
După 64, când e eliberat, nu? A fost amnestia.
It was after 64 that they were released, on amnesty, that I met him for the first time. I was surprised, of how well he looked. The same face, the same distinction, a kind of elegance.
Așa un fel de noblețe, știi?
Câteodată mă gândeam așa cu un strop de teamă. Poate că
Sometimes I thought, with a drop of fear, that perhaps the people of the West would not believe that it was as terrible as it was to us in jail. For when they would see a man with such vigor and so conquering, even after spending 16 years in prison.
Era îmbrăcat în loden. Era un pardesiu a vremilor de după.
He was dressed in a shag overcoat, a Macintosh of the post-war times, which was not in fashion since 1964. I think I had an inkling. I said, "This guy is Nicolae Margineanu." I greeted him and was surprised with his affable smile. And when he said, "Hello, sir, my name is Nicolae Margineanu," I was completely stunned by the encounter, needless to say.
Nicolae Margineanu was never reintegrated into the educational system. After many interventions and protractions, he managed to obtain a job, much under his professional abilities, as the documentation man at the Academy's library in the Cluj branch. His joy was the books. After being released from the communist jail only 4 years, he published the book The Nature of Science. 2 years later, he published Psychology and Literature, and Under the Kindness Sign, then The Human Condition, and in 1975, he launched the exceptional book Logical and Mathematical Psychology. He worked with frenzy, trying to recover the time which was unrighteously stolen from him. He prayed to God to give him another 16 years of life, as this was the same years he was imprisoned. And God gave him exactly 16 more years.
Omul acesta din Transilvania noastră, bătrână provincie europeană.
This man from Transylvania, an old European province, Romanian and European. I felt like I had a special perception for everything new, for what it can mean, for something positive in the present time and in the future.
Mai ales în viitor.
Și cine citește, revin iarăși, cine citește psihotehnica și condiția umană, se poate, aș spune, se poate lămuri.
Those who read the psychotechnic and the human condition, I'd say could clarify the questions that they have relating to themselves. Professor Margineanu was necessary at this time in Romanian psychology. I refer mainly to how dynamic he was and how he made his spirit understandable, along with how active he was as a man. For instance, I don't believe in professional guidance. If the teachers would only take half of what the professor was teaching, they would come to understand the relationship of what we want to work as and ourselves easily, while for others, such knowledge is not discovered until a very old age.
Lucruri în legătură cu impactul ăsta uneori nelămurit până la adânci bătrâneți între alegerea profesiei și modul în care te potrivești.
Profesorul Margineanu venea la birou obișnuit înainte de ora 8, se închidea la propriu.
Professor Margineanu started work before 8 in the morning. He would lock himself up in his office and speak to the closed door while working directly on the typewriter. He would continue this until 12 or 1, at which point he would open the door and say, "Come in." This was our invitation to come and discuss things with him. I use the word discussion lightly, as it was mainly the professor who spoke and I who listened.
Convorbiri e relativ spus că mai mult profesorul vorbea și eu ascultam.
But he was never permitted to take the chair of psychology again. Instead, he was invited with much warmth to teach. As associate professor at the universities of Cologne, Bonn and Hamburg, and by a miracle he even succeeded in leaving and having the schoolmaster satisfaction. In 1979, at the invitation of the same Rockefeller Foundation, who had given him a scholarship as a student in his youth, Nicolae Margineanu came back to America. In this period, he was working at his book, The Psychology of Depths and Heights, destined to be printed in an American publishing house. The book remained unfinished because, unfortunately, American physicians diagnosed him with cancer.
Being on the brink of death, to write with such fervor about human soul's heights, and with so much tenderness about its death.
This disease determined his return home, to Romania. He died on June 13th, 1980, in Cluj. He had hoped to have a true trial, to clear his name from the unlawful trial. After the communist regime's downfall, at the family's request, the trial was tried again. On March 26, 1998, the Supreme Court of Justice permitted the annulment appeal and decided the acquittal of those convicted. But, unfortunately, none of the acquitted were still alive.
He is one of the brightest figures which Romania had in those hard times. And if I can say, in the whole world during the bloody 20th century. The fact he firmly believed in a couple of values. This was the main cause, I think, for why he survived so well in a communist prison and practically turned out as a vanquisher from there. A few times he says in his books, the firm belief in some values, the truth, the beautiful, and the well, were the values which helped him most in the critical situations. And I think that from him there must be learned, firstly, the fact that our personal ethics isn't a secondary game or an intellectual luxury, but is a fundamental factor on our mental health, and that it can be seen that the effect of these values over the mental health, which we have firstly in the critical situations in which we are put, and not only in situations of incarceration and in the jaws of death, and in front of a lethal diagnostic. This is an essential idea which represents a basic contribution for psychology of Nicolae Margineanu, but isn't only a theoretical contribution. It is a lived contribution. He lived, and he lived his ethics. He didn't theorize the ethics, he lived them.
After the collapse of communism in 1989, the memoirs of Nicolae Margineanu were published, Amphitheatres and Prisons, and again in the complete edition in 2002, with the title Testimonies Over a Tumultuous Century. A street in Cluj is named after him, and an amphitheatre in the psychology faculty in Cluj is named Nicolae Margineanu. The majority of his psychology books, forbidden for years, have been republished and found their proper way into bookshops or libraries. In his last book, Nicolae Margineanu, proposing a reconciliation with the past, leaves the following message to future generations. Against the maltreatment and injustice, the only defense of the people is their full and firm conviction in the final triumph of truth and justice.